Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. As always, I'm your host, Chris Kent, and it's been a bit since I answered any questions from listeners. Recently, I mentioned a couple of analogs of Superman and Supergirl named Captain Adventure and Miss Adventure. So, a college student by the name of Colin Klingler wants to know what is the deal with those characters. So, that's what this video is going to be about, is me sort of giving you some background information about um, some stuff that was going on in the comic book industry at the time that led to their creation, and then the sort of the in-world fiction of of what their deal is. So first and foremost, they are not original characters that I invented for my role-playing game. They were actual published characters. In the late 1980s, there were some artists at Marvel that were becoming a pretty big deal. And in the early 90s, they formed a company called Image Comics. And Image had kind of a reputation at that time that suggested they didn't really care very much about writing, that they thought that good art was all you really needed to draw fans in. And so Image was basically seen as a threat by both DC and Marvel. And the big two thought the best way to compete was to try to outdo Image at its own game. Or at least that's what a lot of people thought. And one of those people was a man by the name of George Caragone. And among other things, he worked in the magazine industry. And a phrase that he threw around quite a bit was, quote unquote, the emperor has no clothes. So, in other words, he thought comic books were in decline for being all flash and no substance. So, George created not one, but two magazines as a platform where creators could tell their stories. And these magazines were kind of akin to like heavy metal, where it was an anthology. And wanting this to be a success, he reached out to really big name creators from both DC and Marvel, guys like Adam Hughes, Keith Giffen, and he would offer these guys big bucks to come write for his magazines. And when I say big bucks, what I mean is that he was paying like three or four times what DC and Marvel were willing to pay. Over the years, I've talked to multiple creators from that era who loved working for George, and all of them would say the same thing, which was quote unquote, everyone wanted to work for him because the pay was so good. And Men's Adventure Comics, at first, anyways, gave those creators a voice through which to vent their frustrations at the state of things. As you can imagine, DC and Marvel are not going to pay anybody to complain about DC and Marvel, right? Um, and then even in the fiction itself, the central protagonist, excuse me, was frustrated by the situation that he found himself in. So that brings us to Captain Adventure himself. Captain Adventure's story begins in the mid 1990s, and our hero is an 18-year-old boy named Joey Pike. One day he receives a shoebox sized package in the mail from a man named Carl Kodiak, who was his father's best friend. In the box is a golden power ring with a letter P on it, which stands for either power or Pike, depending on who you ask. Also in this box are some papers explaining who Joey's father and grandfather were. Joey never knew his dad. He's grown up in the American Southwest with his mom. According to the letter in the box, Joey's grandfather was named Pat Pike. And in the 1940s, he was a fearless archaeologist, kind of akin to like an Indiana Jones kind of a guy, who discovered the legendary Ring of Power in an ancient Aztec tomb. So, donning a colorful costume, Pat became the original Captain Adventure. He battled the enemies of freedom, um, both overseas and on the home front throughout World War II. We don't find out until a later issue, but it turns out, by the way, that Joey's grandma was Dr. Joanna Dare, and she developed her world's version of the super soldier serum which transformed her into an almost She-Hulk-like character. Basically, under extreme emotion, her change was triggered, and she'd go from someone who kind of looked like Diana Prince with like the black hair and the glasses and all that, into someone larger and stronger, who looked kind of like Red Sonja. So at any rate, her and Pat got married, and they had a son named Jack. So flash forward to the 1960s, Jack Pike becomes the Silver Age successor, known as Captain Adventure 2. And he becomes the leader of the Team Supreme, which was their world's #1 superhero team, kind of like the Justice League or the Avengers. And then in the 1970s, under mysterious circumstances, he disappears. So now Joey has the Ring of Power, as well as one of his father's old costumes. So he says goodbye to his mom, and he boards a bus for New York City. And when he gets there, he goes to the Kirby Building in Manhattan, home of the Team Supreme. And the Team Supreme at this point consists of Hurricane and Hot Blood, who both knew Joey's father, as well as newer members like Blazing Fury, Blood Skull, Death Killer, Edge, Manpower, and Red Rogue, who were all analogs of various Image characters who were symbolic of that era and the perceived state of the comic book industry in general. So Joey is sad to learn that Hot Blood's Team Supreme are less like DC's Silver Age Justice League, and they are more like Homelander and the Boys. Hot Blood cares more about like the business end of things and PR and his image and profit and things like that. So Joey decides to strike out on his own rather than be associated with these guys. And as such, he goes right to the top after what is their world's #1 villain, who's this guy named Darkblood. Darkblood is pretty weird, actually. He has two forms, kind of like Captain Marvel. In his seemingly mortal guise, he's reminiscent of the Kingpin, um, and even seems to serve the same role that Kingpin does in Marvel Comics. But when the villain transforms into his alter ego, his powered up form looks kind of like Skeletor. At any rate, so Darkblood is a seasoned villain with a great deal of experience, and this is Joey's first fight. So Joey loses. Hurricane shows up and tells Joey that he's skipping a few steps there. Um, and I don't know if I mentioned it before, but she's kind of like their world's Wonder Woman. Um, and despite the fact that her teammates' bad habits have rubbed off on her to some extent, she is drawn to Joey and the hopefulness and return to form that he represents. And the two of them begin dating. And the relationship between Hurricane and Captain Adventure is complicated to say the least. In 1976, Hurricane was only human, and her name was Emily Feldman. And she was the daughter of Max Feldman, who was the owner of tremendous studios in Hollywood. He seemed to be kind of an analog slash mashup of guys like Maxwell Lord and Aaron Spelling. Captain Adventure 2, Jack Pike, was a mashup of Superman and Captain America. So he had a sidekick named Spunky, who was a mashup of Bucky and Robin. And just as Robin would later grow older and become Nightwing, Spunky would one day grow older and become Hot Blood, the douchebag leader of the 90s Team Supreme. At any rate, so Spunky has a crush on Emily Feldman, but Emily doesn't like Spunky. She's in love with Jack Pike. Jack is on this movie set, which seems to be a reference to all those superhero TV shows in the 70s, like The Hulk, Shazam, Wonder Woman, etc. And long story short, the filmmakers actually managed to restrain Jack for a scene they're getting ready to film. Emily sneaks in and how shall we put this delicately? She retrieves a sample of his DNA, and a bomb goes off, and voila, Emily becomes Hurricane. And so she has powers akin to those of Jack's. Almost immediately after that, by the way, is when Jack disappears in space after a run-in with a mashup of Darkseid and Darth Vader, who is the leader of an evil spacefaring empire. He and Carl Kodiak were best friends, and then Carl comes back to Earth with the Ring of Power. But anyways, getting back to Emily. So she loved Jack and thought he died, and she never ages. So she's basically always college age. And now all these years later, Joey is the spitting image of his dad. He's even wearing the costume. So Emily feels like she has a second chance. But at the same time, she's worried that if she tells Joey that she used to date his dad, or where her powers came from for that matter, that he might leave her, and she's afraid of that. So their relationship was one of those off again, on again type situations. At one point, while they are seeing other people, by the way, Joey briefly dates a girl who's a Namorita analog named Aqua. And in a baffling turn of events, Aqua leaves Joey to date his father. And for some reason, it turns out old Jack Pike is still alive and just living in space. And another confusing thing about that issue is that Aqua supposedly looks just like Hurricane, but they don't draw the two to look anything alike. And while Hurricane is a redhead, Aqua is a blonde. Speaking of blondes and weird revelations, the Star Wars parallels don't stop there, as we learn that Joey has a twin sister named Cammy Pike, um, aka Misadventure. So Cammy was an analog to characters like Power Girl, who she strongly resembled, as well as Mary Marvel, in that if she said a certain word, she would transform. And so in Cammy's case, the word is her last name backwards, which is Ekip. And then she would go from being sort of like flat chested and be speckled to being like well endowed with perfect eyesight. At any rate, in Cammy's first appearance, she goes to New York City where a woman hits on her, and Cammy states that she's heterosexual. But then in a later issue where we learn Cammy's grandmother has become their world's equivalent of like Amanda Waller, or Nick Fury would be the better parallel there because she even has the eye patch. At any rate, in this issue where they're playing cards, we find out Cammy is bisexual. And it's right around this point that the stories begin to contradict themselves more and more, and everything starts to lose cohesion. And that brings us to their biggest editorial problem. Remember earlier when I said that George Caragone had been the man behind a lot of this? Well, so in a sad turn of events, he took his own life on July 20th of 1995. And he was the linchpin that held the whole thing together. So almost immediately, Men's Adventure Comics begins to decline in quality. And I've never heard it said for sure, but I assumed George was the one probably paying out all that money. So, without that, all these guys stop contributing to MAC like almost immediately, right? And then sadder still is the artists and writers who fell in to fill that vacuum seem to miss the entire point of characters like Captain Adventure. While Joey was created specifically to oppose certain 90s trends, the new creative team had him doing exactly those things that he had originally hated so much. The one exception to that was Action Figures. That was another team set in that world, led by Blazing Fury, who had left the Team Supreme to strike out on her own. Blazing Fury was a weird mashup, by the way, of Zealot from Wildcats and like Captain Atom from DC. At any rate, the Action Figures stories had big name artists and maintained its high quality longer than most of the other stories in that anthology did. But after a while, they started to reprint the same earlier action figure stories, but now with computer coloring. And shortly after that, Men's Adventure Comics was canceled. So we will never know if the janitor at the Kirby building, who is secretly Pat Pike, the Golden Age Captain Adventure, we don't know if he ever gets back with Joanna Dare again, um, or if Joey and Cammy ever meet their father face to face, or what happens to Hurricane or the action figures. And by the way, earlier I said there were two magazines that told these stories. I always hesitate to say their names because all too often people turn up their noses to the names without ever giving these stories a chance. And while there were certainly plenty of bad stories that they published, there were some incredibly good ones too. And at any rate, so those magazines were Men's Adventure Comics and Penthouse Comics. Now, that said, I heard that Penthouse Comics came back recently, actually, but my understanding is that they won't be dealing with any of these old characters. But time will tell, who knows? So for the time being, on my end of things, the characters live on in my game world. In our world, Joey and Hurricane had a kid in the late 90s. Cammy had a kid with Superman Red. Pat Pike reconciled with Joanna Dare until he died of old age. Um, After which Joanna continued to keep an eye on her grandkids and great grandkids because I like happy endings. Hopefully that answers all your questions, Colin, and hopefully everybody else liked this video too. If so, smash that like button, make sure you're still subscribed, ring the bell, all that jazz, and we'll see you in the next video.